I saved 600 passengers abandoned by their captain. I'm Moss Hills, a guitarist from the courageous team of cruise ship entertainers. I was about 33 when it happened, about 80 years after the Titanic sank. Even though decades had passed, people were still haunted by stories of shipwrecks. Most Titanic survivors, even the kids, were gone by then, but we'd all heard about the heartbreak and struggle of those who lived through it. My wife Tracy and I never thought we'd ever be on a ship that would come so close to repeating the Titanic story. We were both part of the entertainment team on the Oceanos. It all happened on August 3, 1991. Feels like a lifetime ago now. I'm an old man these days. That morning, I woke up early, took a shower, and joined Tracy for breakfast. She'd already set the table and the smell of hot chocolate, our favorite, filled the air. We sat down together, enjoying the quiet moment. "What time does the ship leave tonight, Moss?" she asked, sipping her coffee and looking at me, waiting for an answer. "Around 9 p.m., baby. Are you ready for tonight?" I said, smiling at her. "I wish it left earlier," she said, her voice soft. "We could get back home sooner. You know my mom's still in the hospital. I should be there with her." I saw the tears welling up in her eyes. Taking her hands in mine, I said, "Nothing bad's gonna happen, Tracy. She'll be all right." I pulled her into a hug, holding her close, trying to ease her worry. She'd become a little more sensitive lately, mostly because of her mom, and I could tell. After breakfast, we cleaned up the table and put everything back in the fridge. We sipped on our hot chocolate, and then she asked me to go shopping with her. We picked up groceries, clothes, fruits, and veggies. After we got back, we put everything in its place. That day, Tracy said she couldn't cook, so I made lunch for us. We ate together, completely unaware of what was about to happen in just a few hours. We took a short break, and by 3 p.m. I washed the dishes. We then took a quick nap. Both of us were looking forward to the night, but before that, I pulled out my guitar and started practicing. I always used it to get ready for the show later. Tracy was sitting there, looking at me, and I remember her saying, "You play the most beautiful songs, Moss. I feel like I'm in heaven when I'm with you." I kissed her and said, "Thank you, babe. My heaven is being with you." We left home around 7 and got there quicker than usual. We were both full of energy but hadn't eaten dinner yet, so we went to the restaurant on board and had dinner. It was about 8:30 when we finally boarded the ship. When we got there, the captain made an announcement that we'd have a 2-3 hour delay. 3 hours? I asked, my eyes wide in disbelief. The captain looked me up and down and replied, "Do you have a problem with that? We can change your entertainment group if it bothers you." He was always a bit rude. His name was Yanis Avranas, an experienced seaman who'd been sailing for 30 years, with 20 of those as an officer. I couldn't stand him. He was proud, selfish, and always angry. He was bossy and had no problem insulting the crew members or being rude to them. We didn't have much of a choice but to wait for about 3 hours in the waiting hall. Everyone was exhausted from waiting, and the passengers were just as frustrated. Many of them were thinking of canceling their tickets, but the line wouldn't let them. They had no choice but to get on the ship. Want to know the problem? The ship was really old. It had been built in France and first launched in July 1952. It was a Greek-owned cruise ship that used to run between Marseille, Madagascar, and Mauritius. The engineers were fixing something on the ship, but we couldn't tell what it was. What we could see clearly was that the ship was falling apart. There were holes in the walls, loose hull plates, and missing parts that controlled the flow of water. The whole thing looked like it hadn't been taken care of at all. I still remember Tracy saying, "Moss, why is this ship so old? It feels like it might not even be able to sail." I was a little worried, but not too much. In all my years working on ships, I'd never experienced any accidents at sea. But there was something that made my heart race more than usual. "Huh?" An old man nearby said, "It looks like the Titanic." My hands and feet went cold. I couldn't help but ask, "Have you ever seen the Titanic?" He looked at me and replied, "Not me, but my brother did. He said this ship looks just like it. I hope it doesn't end up with the same fate." Then he laughed almost crazily. I didn't feel good about what he said. I grabbed Tracy's hand and tried to pull her inside the ship. When all the passengers had boarded, as usual, we had a small party. The crew organized a sail-away party on deck with the entertainers and musicians. We got ready. I took out my guitar and started playing. My colleagues were singing and playing along too. We were all having fun, popping champagne and drinking. Passengers were dancing in couples, and we could see the perfect view of the ocean, the moon, the light breeze, and couples kissing each other. Unfortunately, it didn't last long. Everything started going wrong. In just a few seconds, the ocean turned wild. It was raining cats and dogs, and the sea got incredibly rough, so the party had to move inside to the Four Seasons Lounge. Even then, most of the passengers didn't want to leave their cabins during such a powerful storm. But things soon got worse. Several hours into the dinner party, the waiters were struggling to balance their trays without dropping something. The lights kept flickering on and off, and my gut was telling me something was wrong. While I was playing the guitar, Tracy quietly whispered in my ear, "Moss, don't you feel the ship shaking? It feels like it's shaking too much. I'm not feeling good about this." I tried to convince myself it was nothing, and I told Tracy the same thing, trying to calm her down. At one terrifying moment, everything started sliding off the tables. Plates, glasses, cutlery, people couldn't keep their balance, and even the potted plants in the lounge began tipping over. The problem was, in an attempt to make up for the delay earlier, the Oceanos sailed straight into some rough waters. It turned out to be a huge mistake. For one, the ship's waste management system was still under repair, meaning that several key parts hadn't been replaced yet. But it wasn't just the storm that made things worse. The ship ended up facing something way more dangerous: rogue waves, or what they call monster waves. These waves are massive and totally unpredictable. They can appear out of nowhere and can seriously damage even the biggest ships. With these giant waves slamming into the Oceanos, it didn't take long for the hull to crack, and seawater started flooding the engine room fast. As the water rose, it was obvious that the generators were in serious danger of short-circuiting, so they were quickly shut down. The Oceanos lost power and started drifting aimlessly. Most of the passengers had no idea what was going on, but that wasn't going to last. The ocean water began flooding the ship through the drainage system, spilling uncontrollably from toilets, showers, and everywhere else. The ship was sinking, slowly but surely. The main lights went out, and the only thing left were emergency lights dimly lighting up the public areas. You'd think, with all this going on, that the crew would have jumped into action, telling the passengers what was happening and starting an evacuation, right? Not this time. On the sinking Oceanos, the crew didn't do anything like that. The captain and the crew were only thinking about saving themselves, leaving everyone else to deal with it. I still wonder how anyone could be so irresponsible. I ask Tracy all the time how none of them cared enough to tell us what was happening, how they could be so cruel and heartless. Didn't they care about the kids, the elderly, the women, or the young people? Was their own survival really worth more than the passengers' lives? Those are the questions that still haunt me. Once the crew realized that the situation was beyond saving and the ship couldn't be rescued, they got ready to bail. They didn't follow standard procedures like securing the portholes on the lower decks, and they didn't even bother raising the alarm. So, the passengers were left in the dark until the water started flooding the lower decks. Those who figured out how bad things were rushed to the bridge to find the crew, only to discover that it was empty. Later, some witnesses said they saw the captain and a few crew members already packed and ready to abandon ship. Ever heard of the rule that says the captain should be the last one to leave a sinking ship? Yeah, well, that went completely out the window on the Oceanos. And if the captain can't get the passengers and crew evacuated, he shouldn't even think about saving himself. But of course, that principle didn't mean anything here. The captain and his crew didn't stick around to help. They took off in several lifeboats without a second thought. Thankfully, though, the ship still had us. Before everything went south, most of the passengers had gathered in the main lounge to watch the 1 a.m. show. but people started feeling uneasy as they noticed something wasn't quite right on the ship. I was one of the entertainers, performing as a singer and guitarist. I could tell something was off, but I didn't realize just how serious it was at the time, so I kept performing, trying to keep everyone calm and distracted to prevent panic. The power had gone out, so none of the microphones or speakers worked, but I just picked up my acoustic guitar and sang instead. Under the dim emergency lights, I kept playing my acoustic guitar, trying to keep things light and sing for the passengers, but between songs, they kept asking me what was going on. I was running out of good answers and ways to keep them entertained, and honestly, I started feeling uneasy. Something didn't feel right. My gut was telling me things were wrong, so I decided to go check it out. After everything happened, the captain tried to deny that the ship was sinking, but still told us to prepare for an evacuation. His conflicting words didn't make sense, so I teamed up with my fellow entertainer, Julian Butler, to head to the crew-only area and figure out what was really going on. The ship was rocking violently, and those slippery staircases were tough to climb, but we managed to make our way to the lowest deck. To our surprise, the deck was dry. We looked around for any signs of water, but found nothing. Feeling a bit lost, Butler, who's not just a colleague but also my best friend, and I decided to head back up to the upper deck. When we got there, we saw several lifeboats had already been lowered, and women and children were boarding them. But here's the crazy part. Some senior officers were climbing into the lifeboats too, and there didn't seem to be anyone in charge of the situation. That raised even more red flags, so I decided to go back to the lower decks on my own. As I got close to the engine room, I heard the unmistakable sound of rushing water. Turning the corner, I saw the nightmare come to life. The ship was sinking. Once I realized the gravity of the situation and knew we couldn't rely on the panicking crew, I jumped into action. With my wife Tracy and fellow entertainers Robin Boltman and Julian Butler, we started helping the passengers. I kept sending out Mayday distress calls through the radio phone until someone finally heard us. The South African Air Force and Navy responded quickly, sending 16 rescue helicopters, which were expected to arrive soon. On top of that, the Dutch container ship Nedloyd Mauritius heard our distress signal and rushed to help too. Their lifeboats were crucial in getting the passengers off the sinking ship. While all this was going on, I organized the evacuation, making sure women and children were the first to get onto the remaining lifeboat. Unfortunately, by the time the evacuation started, the ship had already tipped onto its side, and not all lifeboats were accessible. But luckily, the helicopters arrived just in time, airlifting 225 people still on board with safety harnesses. And once again, our team made sure the women and kids were rescued first. After everyone was safely off, they were taken to a nearby town, about 6 miles, 10 km away. All 571 people left on the ship after the crew abandoned it were safely rescued. Tracy and I, along with Butler and Boltman, were among the last to leave. The next morning, Boltman told me the captain had called from the shore to check how the evacuation was going. By around 3:30 p.m. the next day, the Oceanos had settled on the ocean floor, 300 feet to below, Oceanos below. The final moments of the ship sinking were actually caught on video and later aired by ABC News. These days, the wreck is about 3 miles, 5 km off the coast, and while some divers try to visit, the strong currents and sharks in the area make diving really dangerous. Not many have actually seen it up close. Tracy passed away 2 years ago, and I miss her more than words can say, but even now I can still feel her presence with me, especially when I think back to those days performing on the ships. We never gave up on our love for the job, and we never let that experience make us walk away from the work we loved. If you have any questions about my experience, drop them in the comments below. And don't forget to like and share the video with a friend. But hey, don't be too hasty to jump into that lifeboat just yet.